Webster, the greatest speech coach in the world. The greatest speech coach in the world, Lance Webster.
It started in the 3rd grade. Let me prove it to you. This is my 3rd grade report card. Here's a note that my teacher, Mrs. Bryant, sent home to my mother. Dear Mrs. Webster, Delancey is a good, that's my real name, Delancey, is a good student, nice boy, but he tends to talk too much, and the other students don't have a chance. Is there anything you can do? Right there. And here's what my mother wrote back. Mrs. Bryant, we have the same problem at home. If you can find a way to keep Delancey quiet, short of gagging him, the entire family would be most grateful. As a young man reading those notes, I realized that my future lay in communication. And I got the first evidence of the power that a communications coach, that is somebody who gives ideas, can have at the University of Virginia. My freshman year, there was a whistle-stop campaign tour down at the train station. A few of us went down, the train stopped, the candidate gave a speech. People drifted off afterwards, but a few of us remained, and the candidate asked us to come up on the platform of the train and tell him what we thought of the speech. Most of the students praised it. I hung back a little. He looked at me and he said, "Young man, what about you?" And I said, "Well, sir, you have done what all politicians do. You ask us what you can do to help us, to make our lives better, to enrich our lives. Essentially, you're trying to bribe us. You're then going to go back and give us what we want, so we'll vote for you forever and ever. Why don't you challenge us in some more meaningful way? Like, maybe ask us if there's some way we can help you." He took out his pen, he made a note, he said, "Thank you," and that was the last I thought of it until a couple of months later when I was listening to President Kennedy and his inaugural address, and he said, "My fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." Now you know where that came from. Of course, they don't always take your advice. A few years later, I was writing speeches for the president of the PBS television network. Some of my friends who worked for congressmen knew I could write good speeches. They asked me to start writing speeches or contributing material for the congressmen, later senators, and then I got that phone call in the middle of the night that you always dread when you live in Washington. "This is the White House calling. Hold on for the president." A few moments later, that voice we all recognized came on the line. "Lance Webster?" "Yes." "This is President Nixon. I have to give a speech on television tomorrow about this Watergate business, and I'm just looking for something to say." And I said, "Well, Mr. President, if you are innocent here, do what you did back in 1952 with the Checker speech, where you promoted your simplicity. This time just look the American people right in the face and say, 'My fellow Americans, I am an honest man.'" He said, I don't think it'll work." And he hung up. And to my horror, the next day, he said, "My fellow Americans, I am not a crook." And that is to this day what we remember. They don't always take your advice. What can I do? But sometimes it isn't that they don't take your advice, it's they don't hear you correctly. A couple of years later, late at night, why do they always call late at night? I'm not sure. But a couple of years later, late at night, the phone rings, and it was the voice that we all recognize. And I said, "Yes, President Reagan." He said, "Well, I have to give a speech next week in front of the Brandenburg Gate. President Gorbachev will be there from Russia. I'd like to say something that influences the whole world. It makes a difference." And I said, "Mr. President, you're a capitalist. You love capitalism. And you are for bringing people together. Why don't you give a speech that challenges President Gorbachev to do something constructive, something with us, something that would really make a difference in the world? Here's what you could say. Look him right in the eye and say, 'Mr. Gorbachev, together, let's build a mall.'" And he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you very well, but I have to go right now." And he hung up, and obviously he didn't hear, and he thought I had said, "Tear down that wall." I still think mine would have worked better. Nonetheless, in the years I've spent advising people, for example, advising both Spiro Agnew and Martin Luther King to use parallel structure and alliteration. Think about it for a minute. I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. Nattering nabobs of negativity. It's all there, and it all came from a master coach and from those calls late at night. You can make a difference with your public speaking. And that's what I've been doing, and that's what I want each one of you to do, Madam Toastmaster.